Ethiopia, the status of Amharas. March 1993. United States Homeland Security. In May 1991, the brutal Mengistu Haile Mariam government was overthrown. The new government, formed by the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, a coalition of ethnic armies which had been largely formed to fight against the Mengistu government, came to power. The EPRDF allowed the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF, to administer the territory of Eritrea independently, and agreed that Eritrea could become an independent country contingent on a referendum scheduled to April 1993. Other ethnic secessionist movements were persuaded to remain within Ethiopia by offers of power sharing within the government on an ethnic basis. Many exiles, including those loyal to Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, who was deposed in the mid-1970s, are returning home. By any standards, the transitional government established by the EPRDF is a vast improvement over the Mengistu government. Freedom of expression, political participation, and rule of law are at a much higher level than during the Mengistu era. Despite strong hostility by some Amharas to both their loss of control of power in Ethiopia and to the EPRDF's decision to grant Eritrea its independence, the EPRDF does not appear to have retaliated against Amharas as a group. The term Amhara is used in this paper to encompass not just ethnic Amharas, but also those who speak Amharic and identify with the concept of a unified centralized Ethiopian state. However, Ethiopia continues to face major challenges, 5 of which could directly and seriously affect the status of Amharas in Ethiopia. Since the EPRDF took power in May 1991, it has not always been willing or able to control ethnic fighting at a societal level. Amharas have died in ethnic fighting, particularly with Oromos, but also with other ethnic groups. At various times over the past year, ethnic fighting has broken out in most areas, including major cities, which Amharas share with other ethnic groups. The coalition of Ethiopian political parties, which is now grouped together as the Coalition of Ethiopian Democratic Forces, COEDF, has not recognized the right of the transition government established by the EPRDF to rule Ethiopia. While the transitional government has been tolerant of those who leave the COEDF's members groups, is not willing to negotiate with the COEDF. Most active COEDF members remain in exile. Armed resistance to the EPRDF continues in the Gondar and Gojam regions, although it's not clear how much control the political parties affiliated with the COEDF have over their armed wings. Human rights groups and the international community have been strongly critical of the transitional government's delay in trying former Mengistu government and military officials detained since May 1991. Human rights monitors are even more critical of the transitional government's decision to disenfranchise and otherwise restrict the political rights of members of Mengistu's political party, the Workers' Party of Ethiopia. Because Amharas dominated these organizations, many of those disenfranchised or held in indefinite detentions are Amharas. When the EPLF assumed power in Eritrea, it summarily expelled Ethiopian soldiers, administrators, and even many Ethiopian citizens who had lived in Eritrea for decades. Many of those expelled were Amharas. Although political conditions are far better than they are during the Mengistu era, human rights monitors stress that serious problems remain unresolved. The June 1991 elections were seriously flawed. Arbitrary executions, detentions, political killings, and widespread suspension of the judicial system continue to be problems. While these conditions affect other ethnic groups as well, they restrict the chances that Amharas will have reasonable access to legal avenues for redressing grievances listed above. Scope of this profile. This profile addresses only the status of Amharas in Ethiopia, including those who were expelled from the territory of Eritrea. The focus was determined not because Amharas are or are not at greater risk in Ethiopia than other groups, such as the Oromo and Afar. Rather, it was chosen because most Ethiopian claims for asylum in the United States are from applicants who describe themselves as Amhara. The term Amhara encompasses not just the Amhara ethnic group, but also a broader category of Ethiopians who speak Amharic and who identify with the concept of a united, centralized Ethiopian state. In the words of the former Associate Director of Africa Watch, Alex Dewal, Amharas comprise several groups. One is the peasants of the northern regions. These people speak the Amharic language and have a cluster of cultural traits in common, including adherence to Orthodox Christianity, certain traditions of land tenure and social organization, and the use of certain agricultural techniques. Another group is the Neftanya, settlers in the southern groups regions who were closely associated with the land-owning, governing and military classes of the empire. A third category is the urbanized or government-related ruling class. Historically, these people have formed the core of an indigenous conquest state and have social attitudes to match. Many are assimilated from other ethnic groups, having become Amhara by adopting the Amharic language, Orthodox Christianity, and other cultural traits. These latter two categories formed the bulk of the army's officer class and the government bureaucracy. Many of those commonly described in the Western press as Amharas, including former Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie, members of the military junta which overthrew Haile Selassie, and deposed Ethiopian ruler Mengistu Haile Mariam, were either of mixed ancestry or not ethnic Amharas. For clarity, some scholars refer to those who speak Amharic were assimilated through university education or military or civil service, and identify with the dominant culture as Ethiopian nationalists or centralists. Although this paper uses the term Amhara, it does so in the broadest sense. Information in this report will be relevant to those who are not ethnic Amharas, but who might be identified by others as part of the old ruling elite because of their positions in the military or civil service, their opposition to Eritrea's separation from Ethiopia, or their opposition to the EPRDF system of ethnic representation. The transition from Mengistu to the EPRDF. Ethiopia and Liberia are the only African states which were never formally colonized by European powers. Ethiopia has existed as an empire for over 2,000 years, dominated primarily by the Amhara and the Tigray ethnic groups. Since the late 19th century, an ethnic Shoan Amhara royalty and those who assimilated into the dominant Amhara culture largely controlled political and economic power. The social structure of Ethiopia was feudal, with a variety of land tenure systems, in which nobility could demand tributes or taxes and labor from serfs. The system was particularly exploitative in southern Ethiopia, where the nobility was essentially an occupying force, not sharing the language or culture of the local population. Eritrea, colonized by Italy in 1890, was the only portion of Ethiopia to experience colonial rule. In 1935, Fascist Italy defeated Ethiopian military and occupied the country until the British gained control from 1941 to 1942, when Emperor Haile Selassie was returned to power. The British continued to rule Eritrea until 1952, when an autonomous Eritrean government in a federated union with the Ethiopian government governed the territory. This system remained in place until 1962, when the Eritrean Assembly, many of those members had been accused of accepting bribes, voted unanimously to turn Eritrea into to be governed by Ethiopia. Eritrea's political party system was abolished. Its relatively free press censored. Amharas were given most of the top administrative positions, and the principle of parity between Muslims and Christians ended. The secessionist Eritrean Liberation Front, formed in 1955-58 by Muslim separatists and joined soon after by Christians, turned to armed opposition to Ethiopian rule in 1961. The EPLF remained the primary Eritrean opposition movement until 1970, when the breakaway Eritrean People's Liberation Front, initially more urban, intellectual, leftist, and Christian than the EPLF, gained ascendancy. The failure of the aging Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie to halt the war in Eritrea, coupled with prolonged drought and famine, or reform a grossly exploitative feudal system, led to a military coup in 1974. The new Ethiopian government, eventually headed by Major Ethiopian Haile Mariam, Mengistu Haile Mariam, embarked on an ambitious program of land redistribution and nationalization intended to completely restructure Ethiopian society. Although the revolution was initially popular in southern Ethiopia, the former aristocratic class, wealthier peasants, and landlords in the north opposed it. Widespread opposition to the Mengistu government formed within the first few years after the military coup. One source of opposition was from ethnic armies, including the Tigray People Liberation Front, the Oromo Liberation Front, the Somali Abo Liberation Front, the Afar Liberation Front. Another was from the political parties which were not explicitly ethnic based, such as the Ethiopian Democratic Union and the Ethiopian People Revolutionary Party. Most of these ethnic and political parties were more committed to a socialist revolutionary philosophy than the Mengistu government, but opposed military rule or Mengistu's failure to accommodate the interests of those who had not assimilated into the dominant Amhara culture. The failure of Mengistu government to accommodate other ethnic groups, its early decision to oppose any form of federation or separation for Eritrea, and authoritarian forced resettlements introduced in an attempt to alleviate famine increased opposition. Facing insurgencies in most regions of Ethiopia, the Mengistu government resorted to increasingly brutal repression. Prolonged drought and war contributed to a series of devastating famines in the mid and late 1980s, which alienated many of those who had initially supported the Mengistu government's attempt to restructure the society. By 1977, the EPLF controlled most of Eritrea except for the major cities and roads. The TPLF-led EPRDF was capturing territories from its stronghold in northeastern Ethiopia. And in the southern Ethiopia, the OLF was also engaged in battles with government troops. The Ethiopian government eventually agreed to negotiate with the various ethnic armies in an attempt to reach some form of political settlement. While the talks were scheduled, EPRDF troops moved closer to the capital and EPLF troops in Eritrea captured the few remaining cities under Ethiopian military control. On May 21, 1991, Mengistu fled Ethiopia for Zimbabwe, apparently without informing his closest associates. A caretaker government led by Tesfaye Gebrekidan, a former defense minister recently appointed vice president, and Tesfaye Dinka, an ex-foreign minister appointed prime minister, released almost 200 political prisoners and protected intact government security files containing information which is expected to help convict former Mengistu officials for human rights abuses and corruption. In a final attempt to negotiation, the EPRDF, the OLF, Prime Minister Tesfaye Dinka of Mengistu government, the EPLF met with the United States Assistant Secretary of State Herman Cohen in London, May 27, 1991. Tesfaye Dinka attempted to include the COEDF as one of the political forces in Ethiopia in the negotiation. Although the United States did not specifically object the COEDF inclusion, it eventually accepted the EPRDF's resistance to this inclusion. As the negotiations proceeded, Israel arranged to pay $35 million into the Ethiopian treasury in exchange for an airlift to Israel of most of the remaining Ethiopian Jews, commonly referred to as Falasha. Meanwhile, the EPRDF's army moved closer to the Ethiopian capital. The United States recommended that the EPRDF enter the capital in order to reduce uncertainties and eliminate tensions. With the EPRDF in control of the capital, the London talks concluded with a promise of a multi-party conference in July 1991. Many Ethiopian exiles who were not aligned with the EPRDF or other armed opposition groups strongly criticized the decision of the United States to accept EPRDF's control of Ethiopia, which in their view abandoned attempts to reach a political settlement. The United States government maintains that the July 1991 conference in Addis Ababa constituted a political settlement, although not all Ethiopian parties participated in the conference. The first few months of the transition were tense. Many residents of Addis Ababa, most of whom are Amhara, were hostile towards the Tigrayan-dominated EPRDF, which they viewed as an occupying army. In the first few months after the takeover, the EPRDF banned public demonstrations, citing the approximately 80,000 guns in the hands of the capital's residents as their justification. Amharas, mainly students and unemployed workers, in repeated defiance of this restriction, gathered in crowds insulting the Tigrayans, criticizing the United States for abandoning talks, and objecting to the EPRDF's decision to accept EPLF's control over Eritrea. The EPRDF dispersed several of the demonstrations peacefully, but killed at least 3 people in the demonstration. In general, the EPRDF troops proved to be well disciplined, restoring peace in the capital and in many parts of the Ethiopian countryside. They also proved far more pragmatic and conciliatory than the EPLF's history as a hardline Marxist organization led observers to expect, attempting to form alliances and coalitions instead of relying solely on force. In a key strategic move, they managed to form an alliance with the Oromo Liberation Front, with whom they had clashed militarily in the past. Oromos represents 40% of the Ethiopian population, and the OLF is the largest of the Oromo armies. Although relations between the OLF and the EPRDF have been extremely tense throughout the post-Mengistu period, the EPRDF has managed to avert civil war. As promised at the end of the May 1991 peace talks, the EPRDF held a national conference in early June to elect an interim government, the Transitional Government, whose legislative body is the Council of Representatives, form a constitution and set goals for local and national elections. The conference proved more broad-based, open, and productive than even the most optimistic observers expected. The COEDF and its affiliates, such as the EPRP and Mason, however, were not represented at the conference. The EPRDF allocated itself 32 of the 87 seats in the Council of Representatives it created. It allocated 12 seats to the OLF and the remainder of two smaller ethnic and constituent-based parties, including one for university professors and one for workers, many of which were created immediately before the National Conference convened. The conference was attended by representatives of every major and most minor Ethiopian ethnic groups, and both Muslims and Christians. There were general agreement on a secular state, national parliamentary elections within short period, regional or ethnic self-government, and self-determination of those groups which decided by referendum to form a separate state. As will be discussed in a greater detail below, although conditions in Ethiopia in general continue to be fairly positive, problems related to human rights and political participation have not been fully resolved. Opposition political parties outside the government coalition have been allowed to form and to advocate positions, such as reunification with Eritrea, which the EPRDF does not support. Over 100 political parties formed in the first year following the coup, and demonstrations were held weekly in Addis Ababa by groups advocating a full range of political views. Conditions leading to and during the June 1991 elections, however, were not completely conducive to open political participation. The OLF and some other parties in the governing coalition and some parties which did not hold seats in the Council of Representatives including the All Amhara People's Organization, AAPO, boycotted the elections. They charged with validity the unresolved problems with the process, discussed the unresolved problems with the process, made free and fair elections impossible. International observers agreed that the elections were severely flawed, although they disagreed on whether the problems were due to poor management and training of election officials or to a deliberate attempt by the EPRDF to intimidate voters and manipulate results. Immediately following the elections, the OLF withdrew from the coalition government and fighting broke out between the EPRDF and the OLF. The EPRDF's troops, better organized and equipped, easily defeated the OLF. The EPRDF set up camps to detain Oromos. An estimated 19,000 Oromos were still in detention at the end of 1992, including not just OLF fighters but also children and elderly. The EPRDF has announced no plans either to release or change these detainees. In the months following the OLF's defeat, the EPRDF and OLF have agreed to try to negotiate a settlement through international mediators whereby the OLF can be reintegrated into the coalition government and election can take place in those areas in Ethiopia where they were cancelled in June 1992. A solution has not yet been reached. OLF members continue to reserve the rights to secede and object the EPRDF's dominance over the national army, but the feared return to full-scale civil war was not taking place. The OLF's primary interest appears to be persuading the EPRDFs to agree that the June elections were fraudulent and hold them again. At present, while the government is willing to agree that the elections were flawed and is planning to hold elections in areas where they were cancelled, it does not appear willing to cancel the results of June 1992 election. However, the Vice Minister of Internal Affairs, ክንፈ ገብረመድህን, expressed the EPRDF's desire to reintegrate the OLF into governing coalition. To some degree, the OLF accommodate the interests of members of Amhara Oromo elite who feel removed from the political process. As of November 1992, Ethiopia's overall prospects seem fairly good. Make-up elections are being held in some of the regions where ethnic conflict prevented them in 1992. In October 1992, the transitional government established by the EPRDF lifted the remaining censorship laws. From a review of foreign broadcast information several service reports, it's clear that the level of ethnic clashes in Ethiopia is at one of its lowest points since the coup. But there are unresolved issues which could continue to affect the human rights situation in Ethiopia. The OLF and some parties outside the governing coalition perceive the EPRDF as a single-party dictatorship. Some opposition groups continue to express concern that the EPRDF may drop to its attempts to rule by consensus. Africa Watch and the widely respected Ethiopian Human Rights Council continue to report serious human rights violations committed by the EPRDF, the OLF, and other political groups. These reports include arbitrary executions, detentions, political killings, and widespread suspension of the rule of law. Radio broadcasters continue to report violence against Amharas as well as other ethnic groups in rural areas. Although some violence is due to banditry, some appear to be ethnically motivated. Continued clashes in the Gojam region indicate the remnants of the EPRDF. Status of Amharas in the post-Mengistu area. Although the number of representatives allocated to each ethnic groups in the new governing council of representatives reflected more their relative military strength than their percentage in the population, all ethnic groups, including Amharas, are represented in the Council of Representatives. In the first cabinet formed after the transition, there were 4 Amharas, including the Prime Minister, Tamrat Laini, 6 Oromos, 3 Tigrayans, and other ministers from 8 other ethnic groups in the 16-member cabinet. Although the ruling coalition appears to have a higher percentage of Christians than the approximately 50% in general population, there are 3 people listed in the cabinet who are Muslim and 4 more who are believed to be Muslim. The Indian Ocean newsletter suggests that the EPRDF has created ethnic parties among the smaller ethnic groups and given them power out of proportion to their numbers in the population to prevent the elites of stronger and larger ethnic groups, particularly Amharas and Oromos, from dominating the new government. Tensions between the transitional government established by the EPRDF and Amhara, in the broad sense of both ethnic Amharas and those who have assimilated into the formerly dominant Amhara culture, stem from a variety of related issues. The Amhara culture has dominated Ethiopia for over a century, first under the feudal aristocracy and then under military dictatorship. For many Amharas, the transition from Mengistu to EPRDF represents a much greater perceived loss of social stature and personal security than the 1974 Ethiopian revolution. Since the EPRDF took power in May 1991, there have been numerous reports of Amharas or Amharic speaker taunting EPRDF soldiers, calling them provincial bushmen or worse. Most Amharas also strongly disagree with the EPRDF decision to allow Eritrea to break off into a separate country. Those who assimilated into the dominant Ethiopian culture, Amhara speakers and other Ethiopian nationalists, view Ethiopia as a single nation that should not be broken apart. The EPRDF has for the most part been fairly tolerant of Amharas on these two issues, problems adjusting to the EPRDF's accession to power and Amhara opposition to Eritrean independence. Observers commented on the relatively high level of discipline and restraint displayed by EPRDF soldiers when they took over Ethiopia. The EPRDF tolerates Amhara-dominated political groups within its coalition, such as the Ethiopian Democratic Union and the Ethiopian National Democratic Organization, which continue to protest Eritrean secession. Furthermore, predominantly or exclusively Amhara political parties, such as all those calling for a return of the Amhara monarchy, are permitted to demonstrate and publish material. Serious flaws within the June 1992 election call into question the extent of these political rights. Nonetheless, the EPRDF itself does not appear to be targeting Amharas solely on the basis of their ethnicity. As mentioned in the introduction, however, there are serious unresolved political issues which do affect the status of Amharas in Ethiopia. Each of these ethnic clashes, continuing tensions between COEDF and EPRDF detention and the disenfranchisement of former military, government and party officials of the Mengistu era, the expulsion of Ethiopians from Eritrea and continuing deficiencies in the rule of law will be discussed later. Continuing ethnic fighting. Amharas are concentrated primarily in Addis Ababa and northwest portion of central Ethiopia. However, as rulers of Ethiopia for more than a century, some Amharas have lived for generations in other areas of the country. The capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, while predominantly Amhara, is predominantly Oromo area. Furthermore, both the Ethiopian emperors and the Mengistu government relocated Amharas into ethnic Oromo areas of southern Ethiopia. Mengistu did it so in part to severe drought conditions and insufficient arable land in traditional Amhara areas. Amharas therefore are now an ethnic minority in many regions of the country. In the post-Mengistu era, Amharas have been involved in ethnic clashes with various other ethnic groups in early days following the EPRDF's capture of Addis Ababa. The EPRDF killed a few Amhara demonstrators in the city. In an incident in January 1993, at least one student was killed in a demonstration reportedly organized by All Amhara People's Organization. There have been few other documented reports of attacks by the EPRDF on ethnic Amharas or clashes between Amharas and the EPRDF. There have been clashes between EPRDF and the now predominantly Amhara EPRDF as a political military group, as will be discussed below in the section of the COEDF. The EPRDF has attempted to preempt a number of potential conflicts between ethnic groups by introducing arrangements designed to protect minorities and compensate ethnic groups displaced by Eritrea's self-governance. The cities of Addis Ababa and Harar have been designated charter towns, in which minorities are guaranteed full legal protection, and towns in southern Ethiopia with Amhara minorities are also being given special status to protect all ethnic minorities. Although the EPRDF appears committed to these group principles, it has not been able to enforce them except in Addis Ababa. The issue of whether Amharas could be moved out of areas where they are a minority into predominant Amhara areas is one human rights monitors and the media have not discussed. Based on available evidence, however, the internal relocation does not appear a realistic option at present. As mentioned above, the EPRDF apparent strategy is to try to protect ethnic minorities through legal means rather than relocation. The Ethiopian government is currently trying to cope with an estimated 350,000 demobilized soldiers, several million refugees who have returned to Ethiopia since May 1991. Ethiopians who have already fled ethnic violence in various parts of Ethiopia and drought conditions, which international aid groups estimate could leave more than 8 million Ethiopians at the risk of starvation. Although the Ethiopian government has dropped many of its socialist goals, it has remained adamant of on government control of land nationalized under Mengistu. Land is not technically available to anyone relocating within Ethiopia except through the government. The government is currently allocating land to returned refugees, but the program is far too small to meet current needs. Jobs for wages are extremely scarce in Ethiopia, and aid from external donors is not presently sufficient to meet the needs of the existing refugee population. Given these conditions, there could be no guarantee of survival for someone attempting to relocate inside Ethiopia to escape ethnic violence. There have been numerous clashes between Amhara and other ethnic groups, primarily but not exclusively the Oromos. Since the May 1991 coup, ethnic clashes affecting other ethnic groups are also occurring, but are beyond the scope of this study. Although the number of clashes has dropped in the past few months, the tensions which led to such clashes have not been resolved. Some reports of clashes still occur, and conditions suggest that more widespread ethnic violence could flare up again. 1. In early January 1993, police fired on an unauthorized student demonstration reportedly organized by the All Amhara People's Organization. Sources report that at least 1 and possibly 4 students were killed. The students were demonstrating against a United Nations-backed plan to conduct an independent referendum in Eritrea. In May and June 1991, before the EPRDF lifted its ban on demonstrations, thousands of Amhara students and unemployed workers marched in protest outside the United States Embassy protesting the American abandonment of the London peace talks and recognition of the EPRDF as the Ethiopian government. The EPRDF broke up 2 demonstrations peacefully but killed several protesters in other demonstrations. Fighting between Oromos and Amharas along religious and ethnic lines has led to deaths toll of perhaps 500. In some incidents, the fighting appears to have been initiated by Oromos. In other incidents, fighting appears to have started when Amharas provoked Oromos with anti-Muslim or anti-Oromo slogans. Sporadic fighting between Oromo and Amhara in the regions of Dredoa in eastern Ethiopia has continued during much of the period since EPRDF took power in May 1991. Muslim church leaders representing the Oromos and Coptic church leaders representing Amharas were only partially successful in calming the situation. In the worst single incident, it was alleged that OLF members killed about 150 Amharas and other non-Oromos, including Tigrayans in eastern Ethiopia's Hararghe province. The OLF admitted that its supporters were responsible for the massacre, but stated that the OLF had not planned to condone the incident. Isas in the border area near Eritrea and Djibouti, who as predominantly Muslim group felt marginalized by both the Mengistu government and the EPRDF's Transitional Government, have attacked Amharas and Tigrayans, both predominantly Coptic Christian. In one such incident, Isas stopped a public bus, separated all the Amharas and Tigrayans from the rest of the passengers, and shot and killed all the Amharas and Tigrayans. Eritrea summarily expelled many Ethiopians who have lived in Eritrea for as long as 30 years, while some were members of the Mengistu army or the Ethiopian government bureaucracy. Some were private citizens. Many were told to leave with little notice, and were unable to sell property or bring possession with them. Some wounded Mengistu army soldiers were tracked to the border and left, while many of those expelled were Amharas. Other ethnic groups were also expelled. So this is the situation of Ethiopian Amharas in 1993, as seen by the State Department of United States, and we can see that from this article that the American government was fully supporting the Tigray People Liberation Front, which has dominated Ethiopian economy and politics almost the past 3 decades, and they were against a united Ethiopian people, a united Ethiopian country. They perceive Ethiopians in general as different nations and nationalities, not just a united Ethiopia. For Americans, that's why they have been supporting the TPLF. Not just because TPLF was incorporating all the agendas of the United States in the Horn of Africa, but United States' perception towards a united Ethiopia as a single country is not supported by America for generations. That's why we are facing the same situation now. Ethiopians are dying, especially Amharas are not the first victims, the prime victims of the political system, the political arrangement of the last 3 decades. The prime targets are Amharas and those people who speak Amharic language, and who were who believe that Ethiopia as a single country is not for disintegration. Those people who believe a united Ethiopia are suffering because of the system, the political arrangement, which has been and still in use up to this date, starting from 1991. Thank you.